contents warning. Descriptions of pain, death, and torture. My grandfather recently passed away. So, almost immediately after the funeral, my parents and I went to his place to try and figure out what we could scavenge. My grandfather only had one kid, my father, and he only married my mother, so there wasn't much competition or anyone to tell us what belonged to what and who belonged to who. So, while my parents searched down below trying to find any valuables they could pawn off, they sent me up to the attic. Even though it was mostly full of junk, they figured there was one or two things there that might be valuable. So, I went through it. And honestly, his attic was full of junk. A lot of cobwebs, a lot of dust. I sneezed so many times that day. But in the end, there was a few things interesting. In one corner, I found a full-length mirror that had a laser-etched sentence on the bottom. "You look lovely." Don't know why my grandfather would have something like this, but I figured he was a strange guy, so it made sense. But as I went through more and more stuff, I found a few other things that my parents definitely found interesting. There were 2 different water jugs that were full of denarii coins, so they definitely would be interested in all that silver. But beneath the jugs, I found a container that was almost empty. It was so light that at first I thought it was empty, but when I peered inside, I found an old-fashioned lantern. Like, really old-fashioned. It had 8 different sides to it, and each side had its own panel that you could pull up and down to like direct light in a certain direction. It was weird. The most interesting thing, though, when I pulled it out, was I noticed each of these panels were etched. Into the dark iron panels, there was copper images etched in. It almost looked like something out of Paradise Lost. I could see large rivers with people drowning below it, trying to reach up and get out. I could see a many-headed dragon where people were happily walking into its mouth. On one side, I saw a serpent sitting in a tree. But on top of all of these images, I could see a single figure in a large hood holding up a lantern. It almost looked like the lantern that it was engraved on, which was kind of cool, I guess, a lantern in a lantern. Still, though, looking at it, I shook it, trying to figure out if it was valuable. There was no rattle or anything, but still, it was old-fashioned, and sometimes old things were valuable. Pulling up a panel to see what was inside, I was surprised. Inside there was a flame, and there was even a light coming out as soon as I pulled out the panel. This was really weird because there was no apparent fuel source for the flame, and despite the flame and the panel being removed, it felt cold. Thinking that this was pretty cool, I set it down, keeping the panel open so that way there could be a light cast while I continued my search. As I continued going through the attic, I noticed strange shadows in the lantern's light. So, for example, at first it was just me, but as I went on, I noticed there were other shadows that looked like people. Some were kids like me, some were men, some were women. There was even a knight there for a little bit. But as the shadows came more and more into focus, something else was coming into focus too. This last shadow was much, much bigger than the others. If the knight was 6 feet tall, then this horned shadow was at least 12 feet tall. It approached the other shadows, and the other shadows kept trying to run away from it. Thinking that this was some odd curiosity, maybe a trick lantern or something, I watched the show, but when the horned figure reached one of the shadows, it grabbed the woman and it began to pull. Then I could see in the shadows, even without any noise, I could see the splatter of blood and the shape of her innards as they fell to the ground. This was all starting to get too much to me, so I started going to the lantern trying to close the panel. And this time, though, I could hear noises. I could hear the distant scream of others, and I could even hear a loud bellow and what sounded like cloven hoof prints against wood as the horned shadow got closer and closer to me. Luckily, I closed the panel before it could reach me, but that was definitely really weird. More than a little freaked out by this, I take it downstairs and tell my parents about it. They weren't really interested. They told me if I didn't want it, I could get rid of it because it wasn't anything valuable. I definitely thought about it. I'd be lying if I said I didn't. But in the end, I decided to keep it. Whatever this strange thing was, it was worth keeping. So, when we left and my parents were busy divvying up the silver in the water jugs, I went up to my room. In my room, I turned off all the lights and I sat the lantern down in front of me. Careful with it this time, I opened the panel facing away from me so that way the light could be cast in front on the wall in front of me. And when it was done, at first, not much happened. But then gradually a man's shadow started to come into frame. And as the man's shadow was formed, it came more and more into focus. In time, I could see the old man's shadow was wearing a coat. I could see that he had a cane. I could even see that he was tipping off his hat at someone. But then the shadow became more and more focused and stepped off of the wall, then started to step towards me. This shadow was starting to look familiar. As it got closer and closer to the lantern, its details resolved, and then finally I could recognize it was my grandfather. When he was only 3 steps away from the lantern, I told him to stop, and he stopped. "Oh, hello, Jack," he said. "I see you found the beacon of the Banished." I was more than a little confused, so I asked my grandfather to explain. "Well, you see, the beacon of the Banished is a tool used by the ferrymen to help ferry souls to where they belong in the land of the dead. The light can be cast anywhere, and it can be used to send any souls to the land of the dead, but it can also be used to help guide any souls from the land of the dead back to the land of the living. If you want, I can show you something really cool that you can do with it." Impressed by this, I paused for a second, but then nodded. My grandfather was always nice to me when we were growing up, even if I wasn't always the nicest grandkid. Hell, I forgot to give him a birthday card every birthday, but he never seemed angry about it. But my grandfather's ghost approached, and he picked up the lantern. It seemed now that my grandfather was fully solid, and if I didn't know any better, I think he was alive as ever. My grandfather picked up the lantern, then faced the light towards me, and then stood there for a second. At first, nothing happened, but I figured something was bound to happen. After about a minute, I noticed that the lantern and my grandfather turned away from me and began to wander away. Getting up, I started to wander after my grandfather and the lantern. But as we continued to move, I noticed that we weren't where we were before. For some reason, we were down in a long tunnel, and my grandfather and the beacon were getting further and further away from me. Now, running at a full sprint, I ran after my grandfather, calling after him, "Stop! Hey, slow down! What is it you're trying to show me?" But he just kept going. Maybe he couldn't hear me. But as he grew more and more distant, I became more and more determined to follow him. Clearly, there was some kind of powerful magic here at work, and I wanted to figure out how to use it. Who knows what kind of cool stuff I could do by raising souls back? I could ask so many famous people so many questions. Hell, I would be famous, being able to pull any historical figure from the past. While my mind wandered to all the amazing things I figured I could do with it, my subconscious became dimly aware that my grandfather and the beacon were just a distant dot now. And then I took another step, then the ground below me shattered like glass. I could actually hear the noise of broken glass as I fell. As I fell through the darkness and the pieces blew past me, cutting at my face and getting caught in my hair, I fell and fell and fell for what felt like hours before I plunged through some foul-smelling clouds. These clouds, for some reason I don't understand, smelled like rotten eggs. Then as I fell towards the ground, I noticed something below me. It was one of the worst things I could have ever imagined. I saw endless plains, and at the edges of the plains there were flames seemingly encircling all that I could see. And every inch of the plains below me was covered in naked, bleeding figures. Even miles away I could hear their wails, and I could smell their infected cuts. I could see them squirm against each other like it was an endless sea of bloody maggots. And in the brief glimpses I saw below them before another figure filled the place, below all these figures was even more bloody figures, even more torn up, even more infected, and even in more pain than in those below them. Seemingly, it went down forever. An endless plane of pain where the tortured tortured the tortured. Torturers who were no better off than their victims. And then I noticed as I fell and the breeze pushed me up, I noticed how every eye on the endless plane turned up at me. It was like being on stage, but millions of times worse. They weren't judging me, they weren't entertained by me, they weren't hoping I would succeed. They weren't even apathetic. They were hungry, and I was their next meal. I let out a long scream as I fell, the wind pushing me around so that briefly I was able to turn to face the clouds above. The sky was starless, there was no moon, and I don't even think light had ever touched this world before. But in the clouds, I could see my grandfather, holding the beacon in his hands. He looked down at me with no feeling behind his eyes. And behind him, though, I could see a dim shadow cast by the light of the lantern. The horn shadow that I saw before, that was now cast behind my grandfather by the lantern's light. Before I could fully process what I saw my grandfather's smile, no joy in his eyes, as he closed the panel on the lantern. Then he disappeared, along with the light, and along with the horn shadow, and along with my hope. My last thought before I fell into the crowd of hungry cannibals was, I'm glad I never got him a birthday card. Back in the land of the living, the former grandfather closed the lantern and checked out his new body. He'd done this before. He'd done this many times, but it was still always such a rush getting a new body. But he had to be sure to be careful with it. He would need to live a very long time to be able to have both a family and to have grandkids. So that way he can keep the cycle going. And of course he would have to make sure to hide the beacon of the Banished for a while. Because whenever you opened its lamp, you were opening an invitation to pandemonium. And honestly, you had to be very careful, because you never know who you're inviting back